Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this National Centre for Family Hubs hosted bite-sized training on AMBIT, Adaptive Mentalization-Based Integrative Treatment and Whole Family Working. My name is Julia Mays and I'm the Program Manager in the National Centre for Family Hubs here at the Anna Freud Centre. For anyone who's joining us for the first time today, the National Centre for Family Hubs is an online resource hub and learning network which has been funded by the Department for Education and is being led by the Anna Freud Centre, the UK's leading evidence-based children and families mental health charity. The National Centre is designed to support the development of family hubs and spread best practice across England, taking into account what families say they want and need, what providers tell us about best practice, and what we know from evidence about what works. Today's bite-sized training session is the first in a series of bite-sized training sessions that will be running as part of our National Centre for Family Hubs learning event programme. If you're interested in any of our previous learning events, recordings and resources for all of these are available on our website. And we'll be popping a link to that in the chat now. We also have a couple of other bite-sized training sessions coming up over the coming weeks. So a session for anyone who's interested in integrated care systems, planning, the long-term plan and local transformation plan design in the context of Family Hub implementation, which is happening on the 1st of June. And a session on infant mental health, trauma and cultural sensitivity, which will be running on 15th of June as part of Infant Mental Health Awareness Week. You can also register for our next National Centre for Family Hubs conference. So we'll share a link to our registration page in the chat now as well. You can also join our Family Hubs in Mind Learning Network to receive our newsletter, where we'll share details of future learning events and other useful resources. This session will be recorded and will be available to watch back on the National Centre for Family Hubs website in the coming weeks. Slides will be sent out by email to delegates following the session and shared via our website. The chat function has been disabled this morning, but please do submit any questions or comments via the Q&A function, and there will be some time to explore your questions following the presentation. Closed captions have been enabled for the webinar. So if you'd like to enable these, then please click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. We're really pleased to welcome Liz Cracknell here this afternoon. Liz is Joint Programme Lead for the AMBIT programme here at the Anna Freud Centre. Liz is a mental health nurse by background and systemic practitioner and works in the adolescent therapy team here at the centre. She's also contributed to a number of key publications on the development of AMBIT and has trained and consulted with hundreds of workers in AMBIT in the UK and internationally. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Liz. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Julia, and yeah, welcome everybody. Great to be here. So my kind of plan, I guess, for this for the rest of this hour is I'm going to explain a bit what AMBIT is and what it's for, why it exists. Then we're going to think about what is mentalizing, because it's at the core of the approach, and then have a think about the approach, and I'm going to share a few case examples of how it's been used in various ways in practice. AMBIT's normally a sort of a 4 or 5 day long training, so this is really bite-sized, just a few crumbs. But as Julia said, if you've got any questions, do ask them, or if you want to get in contact with us afterwards because you'd like to know more, please do. So you've already introduced me, so we don't need to do that. Why AMBIT? Why has AMBIT been developed? Well, it's kind of been developed in response to 4 particular dilemmas in the work that our senses, and from talking to lots and lots of workers across different sectors, really limit the effectiveness of some of the interventions that we've got. So firstly, for good reasons, not everyone feels able to trust in the help that we would like to offer, and that's often an adaptive response to circumstances, which we'll say a bit more about in a moment. But that obviously really limits the effectiveness of the ways in which we would like to help. Secondly, that it's not uncommon that young people, children, families have multiple needs kind of across different domains of their lives. often that means the involvement of multiple workers from multiple agencies, and that particular system creates complexity and confusion and sometimes conflict as well, that make the kind of helping process potentially feel less helpful. Thirdly, I guess this is a key assumption of AMBIT, which is that working alongside people who are experiencing distress of any form does have an impact on us as workers, and it should do. So the fact that we feel that distress isn't necessarily the problem, but the effect that it has on us in terms of our ability to do our jobs, to keep thinking, and to sort of stay well in our work has an impact. And then finally, the fourth, it tends to be the case that we're so busy as services and as teams and as systems responding, often feeling quite under-resourced, that it's very difficult to be able to kind of get perspective and zoom out on the work, to have the time to just keep learning and applying that learning in practice whilst responding to kind of all of the need and the things that come up. So the idea of AMBIT is, it's not a sort of a therapy or a treatment or an intervention in itself. It's a framework that is for a whole team or sometimes a whole system to try and address those dilemmas, to make the help that we offer feel more helpful. So AMBIT does stand for Adaptive Mentalization Based Integrative Treatment. Is a bit of a mouthful. The literal meaning, of course, of the word AMBIT is sphere of influence. So that does say something about the model, because we're trying to think of the whole system, the whole area across which we can influence in ways that will help the people who we serve. So it's particularly an approach for helping teams to help people who've perhaps got multiple needs, and where you get this kind of complex multi-agency system. And it has been applied in a range of sectors: health, social care, youth services, justice, education, and kind of voluntary third sector organisations. And increasingly, it's being applied by systems of teams across different sectors in a particular locality. And I'll share a few of the examples of that. So obviously, in the middle of that AMBIT, what it stands for is mentalizing. And I'm guessing that there'll be some people here for whom that's really familiar, and others who haven't heard of it at all before. So I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about why it is at the centre of the model. So this thing here is what we call our AMBIT wheel. It's really just the model in a nutshell. So once we've talked a bit about what mentalizing is, I'm going to go round that wheel and think about how we apply it in all of these different directions. So mentalizing is itself is not a new thing. Having a word for it might feel like a more recent thing over the last few decades. It's just really describing a very basic human function. So when we're mentalizing, it's a thing that we're doing in our minds when we're trying to make sense of people's behaviour, but particularly when we're trying to make sense of behaviour in terms of what might be going on in the person's mind. So I might be trying to make sense of how my mum is behaving on the basis of what she might be thinking or feeling, what her intentions were, what her worries were at that time. I'm trying to make sense of what she's doing, what she's saying, on the basis of what I think might be going on inside her mind. So it's not the same as mind reading. It's not this sort of getting it right, knowing for sure exactly what's in someone else's mind. That's something different for sure. Mentalizing is much more when we're being curious, we're wondering, we're kind of trying to guess what might be going on inside a mind that would make sense of behavior. And if it sounds like something that you do, it absolutely is. It's a very kind of basic human function in ways. It's something that you're doing every day. You'll have done it today. What's important to remember, and is easily forgotten, is that we can mentalize others. We can try and make sense of the behavior of other people, but we can't know for sure. I can also mentalize myself. Often exactly the reasons why I do the things that I do often aren't entirely clear to me. I can't mind read myself sometimes, so I can often only wonder and make guesses as to, you know, perhaps I was feeling a bit stressed and I hadn't been sleeping very well, and I was worrying about all of these other things at that time, and that's why I was a bit short or something in that conversation. So mentalizing is something that I do in relation to another. It's also something that I do in relation to myself. One analogy for thinking about this is this kind of idea of an iceberg. So if you like, in terms of humans, the behavior is the bit that's sticking up above the water. It's the bit that we can see. We can kind of be pretty certain that, you know, somebody is doing or saying the thing that they're currently saying. What is hidden to us always is what's beneath the surface, what's in the mind. So what are the thoughts, what are the feelings, the needs, the hopes, and even further, kind of, what do we know about the context for this person, their life history, their previous experiences? So mentalizing is a bit like doing an exploratory deep dive. It's not literally a deep dive because we don't actually get into someone's head and know exactly what was going on, but it's the sort of imaginative equivalent of that, of trying to dive into what was underneath. And this is absolutely something that we can do, the people who we try to help, including children and adolescents, although our ability to kind of do this continues to kind of develop as our brain is developing into our mid-20s. The problem is it's fragile. So it's a really helpful capacity that helps me to recognize my own emotions, to regulate them, to be able to manage in social situations, to be able to manage conflict and misunderstandings. But our ability to do it isn't fixed. It goes up and down. And it goes up and down according to context. So if this was really happening, this tiger just kind of leaps into my little room here, it's not massively helpful for me to be using this mentalizing part of my brain, to be wondering kind of what's going on with this tiger. I wonder how he's feeling at the moment. It's because there's no survival benefit to that. You know, fortunately, what happens is I get a kind of a fight or flight response going on that prepares me to, in some way, survive what's going on. So, you know, many of you will recognize that as the pretty basic kind of fight or flight response. Thinking about how the brain does that, how the brain works, can be quite helpful in making sense of how sometimes we can do this curious, wondering, mentalizing, thinking about what's beneath the surface thing, and why sometimes it's a whole lot harder. So we've got different bits of the brain that do different jobs. And in terms of the evolution of humans and mammals and all creatures, long ago, we developed bits of our brain that are primed to detect threat and respond to it. So in terms of the location in our brain, that's kind of in the amygdala. It detects threat, sets off a cascade of responses to respond. Mentalizing happens here in the prefrontal cortex, which in terms of evolution is a much more recently developed kind of bit of the brain, and they're it's much more kind of delicate. So when there isn't threat, when I'm nice and calm and I'm okay, that mentalizing bit of my brain can work. I can get curious about others. I can get curious about myself and wonder what's going on. When that amygdala detects danger or threat, what happens is that kind of dinosaur bit of my brain that kind of responds to keep me safe, that kicks in, and quite necessarily, in a way, the bit at the front kind of gets quite dampened down, quite quiet, because, you know, if it is a tiger, I don't really want to be doing mentalizing and weighing things up and decision making. I want to be responding to threat. So if we think of it as a kind of a seesaw, when our emotions are relatively settled, our mentalizing ability is good. As soon as our kind of emotions, we get these strong emotions, our mentalizing ability goes down. And as I said, this is really, really great if what is required in a response to this threat is fight or flight, or sometimes freeze, which is exactly what I would want if it were a tiger. The problem is that often it's not tigers that set off that kind of threat response. The tigers in our lives tend to be relationships and conversations with people who we care about or who we're trying to help. It can be stressful or risky situations. For us as workers, it can be multi-agency meetings or emails from a colleague. When we get the same thing going on, in which our ability to mentalize gets dampened down because we're stressed or we're worried or we're anxious. And of course, many of these particular situations are ones where it would be really helpful to be able to mentalize, and we don't particularly want to be in fight or flight, and yet kind of our brains don't differentiate so much. And so you know, what we're saying is we're often in situations where it's much harder to mentalize than it might be. And when we're not mentalizing, there's some other sort of types of thinking, some thinking styles which tend to kick in. We call them non-mentalizing. That kind of makes it sound like they're bad sorts of thinking. And in fact, as you'll see, each of these is very helpful in the right place, but can kind of get us into trouble slightly when it's in the wrong place. So the first is a kind of a certainty mode. So it's where we lose that ability to know that we can't mind read, we can only guess. So particularly if I get a bit defensive, or I sort of get into a bit of a blaming mode that, you know, you definitely did this just to wind me up, or, you know, this family, this is disguised compliance. They're saying they're going to do it, but they've obviously got no intention. You know, when I'm in that kind of frame of mind, or you know, this social worker they don't get it. They don't know the person like I do. I've become very certain. I've sort of lost that ability to go, actually, I don't know, and I can't know. I can only make guesses. Next is a kind of a pretend mode, and this can kind of come about in various ways. It might be that there's a really, really difficult situation in our team, but it just feels so difficult to talk about that we're all sort of pretending that it's not happening. We're sticking our head in the sand a bit, or it might be, oh, you know, it's totally fine. He hits me sometimes, but you know, that happens in all relationships. It's fine. It's kind of where there's this disconnect a bit between how someone is describing the emotions of a situation and what you might expect. And again, this is very protective in a lot of circumstances, just like it's right to be certain. Perhaps when it comes to a safeguarding thing, we'll do some more reflective thinking afterwards, but it's right to be certain. Equally, it's protective to be in pretend mode sometimes, and to wait until a time where it feels safer to talk about a particular issue or think about a particular issue. And then finally, the third of these sort of main types of thinking that our minds do under stress is this kind of quick fix action mode. So that might be, you know, right, the response to how distressed I am is to go and have half a bottle of wine, or the best kind of response to me being upset with you is to hit you, and that kind of that'll make it feel okay again. As workers, and I recognize this in myself, that when I'm stressed and I'm anxious about a piece of work I'm doing, I can feel like I need to do something, and I feel real pressure to do something right now, which I sometimes do before sort of pausing and thinking, but what's going to be most helpful right now? Do I need to make these referrals out to lots of different services that's going to make me feel better? Is it necessarily going to be helpful? Do we need to just find another way to think about the crisis that we're in at the moment in a bit more of a measured way? And again, that's not to say that quick fix isn't sometimes what is needed. Sometimes it's absolutely needed to make some things safe, but there's also just a risk that we kind of get into action without having done the mentalizing and thinking, and so the action ends up being not quite the best. So I guess what we're sort of saying, or how we would see things, is that mentalizing is a really key function. It's really helpful for children and young people and families in terms of being able to make sense of and manage situations and relationships. It's also really, really crucial to the work that, you know, whatever sector that you're in, our ability to kind of do this, being able to monitor and make sense of ourselves, being able to make sense of others, being able to make sense of children and families, but also to be able to make sense of other professionals. It's a really crucial part of our job. And yet, frequently we're working in environments where it's quite difficult to do this mentalizing because of the stress and the pressure and the worry. So I'm going to say a bit then about how we apply that kind of understanding of mentalizing across the different areas of our work. So I showed this before. This is kind of what we call the AMBIT wheel, and it is sort of a member of a whole family of mentalization-based approaches, if you like. Most of those focus on applying mentalizing theory to direct work with clients, whoever we're trying to help. In AMBIT, generally, people using AMBIT in their practice have got a particular intervention that they offer, whether it's a particular approach to housing support, whether it's a therapy, whether it's the way that you run your education establishment. AMBIT's kind of not replacing that. It's much more a framework to support whatever your intervention is to be as effective as possible by applying mentalizing equally to that contact with, we've said clients, just because AMBIT is applied across so many different settings where we might use different terms for the people that our services serve. We've gone for client as kind of a catch-all. We're thinking about applying mentalizing equally there as we are within our teams, across multi-agency networks, and also to kind of how we create teams and systems that are able to get perspective on the work and keep learning and to capture that learning. So if we go around the wheel, I'm going to start with working with your team. And a key assumption, I guess, as you'll have gathered in AMBIT, is that doing the work that we do has an impact on us. We experience powerful emotions in this work that make it difficult for us to mentalize. So this analogy that we kind of use is, you know, doing this work is risky to some extent. And sometimes even when we're in a team of people, we can get quite isolated, particularly if, you know, we're the only one working with a person who's on our caseload. We can feel quite isolated in terms of the emotions that we experience. And so just like when you're doing something kind of dangerous like this, you don't want to go and do it on your own. You want somebody who's got your rope. What we're interested in AMBIT is how can we make sure that within teams we've got one another's rope, so that we're not just going out there on our own and becoming isolated in the emotions and the risk and so on of the work that we're doing. Because the thing about mentalizing is that we're more able to do it in the context of a safe, trusting relationship. So it's quite difficult for me when I'm in the middle of it to be able to get mentalizing. If I can connect to a colleague who's just a step removed from the situation that I'm in, then hopefully I can kind of get my mentalizing back online and I kind of feel safer in my work. So one of the kind of things that we talk about, and we've got some different techniques and approaches to kind of help with this, is that we've got to balance the different sorts of relationships that we have in our work. That of course it's absolutely crucial that we have a good trusting relationship with the person or persons that we're trying to help. And evidence is pretty clear on that one of the sort of common ingredients of helping approaches is that trusting, helping relationship or therapeutic relationship. But it's almost as though the better a job that I've done at that, the more I've been able to really understand the person who I'm offering my help to, the more likely I am to be impacted upon by being close to their distress or my worry about them or my fear for them. So it's almost like the better a job that I've done at that, the much more I need to be connected to a team who've kind of got my back, they've got my rope. And what I don't ever want to do is fall out of balance. I can become so aligned with my client that I've lost my team a bit. Maybe the normal boundaries that we have as a team, I've just slowly, so that I've hardly noticed it, I've shifted them a bit in a way that might be a little bit unsafe. Equally, I could go too far the other way. We could have an absolutely great kind of sense of each other as the team and really support one another, but we've become too focused on each other, and we've kind of lost our ability to connect to the people that we serve. And so our thinking is you're probably always risking being slightly out of balance one way or another. And so what you want is some kind of explicit model and way of talking about that, to try and keep that balance in check. So we're really interested in help seeking within teams. Do we have a culture where it feels all right for me to say to someone, really regardless of their seniority, someone who's available, oh, I'm feeling really stuck, or I'm feeling much more worried than I normally do about this situation. Can you help me to kind of get my thinking back online? So AMBIT's kind of got some rituals and some practices to try and support that help seeking and help offering culture within teams. So if I move on then to how we apply mentalizing to working with your client, and I guess often AMBIT is applied by services that work with people who are perhaps not sure whether they can or should trust in the help that they've got on offer. And I think often we can use language like that people are hard to reach, or that they're refusing to engage, or that they're difficult to engage, in ways that, whilst it may not be the intention, risk being a bit pejorative and kind of locating that as a problem that exists within the client or the young person or parent carer, rather than actually as just a key part of their problem that makes quite a lot of sense. So we think a lot about how, if you've experienced relational trauma or kind of chronic marginalization and exclusion, or you've had one or more negative experiences of services in the past, actually it makes absolute sense that you might then find it difficult to trust others. Our brains adapt to the circumstances that they find themselves in. And so, if I have experienced harm in relationships before, then my brain adapts by being quite actively distrustful of certain people. And so that absolutely makes sense. That's a great survival function of our brains, that they adapt in that way. So in fact, what we might see as being hard to reach may be, a very reasonable and understandable a brain adaptation. The problem is it leaves you at a really big disadvantage in ways. So whilst it's been protective to not trust people because you've been harmed, it then makes it very difficult to be able to work out, who can I trust, who can I get help from, and often, not necessarily often, but it's not unusual that in our services, if we see that somebody is struggling to trust us, we might say, well, then they're not ready. They're not ready for the help, or they're just not engaging. We can't do this, and so then we might discharge them, which potentially adds another negative experience of the kind of helping interaction. So kind of the slight shift, I guess, is in thinking that it's absolutely our job to try to understand, to mentalize that mistrust, to work out the way in which it makes sense. And then we've got to adapt what we do to work out if we can help that person work out whether we are worth trusting, and the help that we've got on offer, could it be helpful? Because actually it's a privilege. It's a privilege if you've had previous good experiences of help or of relationships, and you're therefore able to approach new helping relationships with a general idea that it might be helpful. That's a real advantage. It's a disadvantage not to have that, and it's our responsibility to understand it and respond. And the relevance particularly of mentalizing, beyond our role in mentalizing the mistrust, is some sort of pretty convincing, increasing evidence around the role of mentalizing in establishing certain types of trust. So epistemic trust is kind of a bit jargony, but really it's a specific type of trust that relates to my trust that somebody has got something of value to me in terms of learning that I might apply in my life. So it's kind of trust in helpfulness, in help. And one of the things that supports the development of that trust is the feeling of being understood, of kind of recognized as an individual. So if someone can give me the feeling that they're not just an expert in their field, but that actually they've understood me, they've understood what this is like for me right now, that kind of opens the door a bit to trust, and therefore for the helping process. So AMBIT, in terms of working with your client, a lot of it is about paying attention to the helping process, so that whatever help you offer can then be helpful. So what we're saying is that mentalizing, the experience of being mentalized, kind of opens the door to this trust, which then opens the door to the interventions that we've got being experienced as helpful. The other bit that we talk quite a lot about in working with your client is to remind ourselves that when we get a referral, when we start to have contact with somebody, we're very rarely starting a helping system, a helping network. We're almost always kind of joining one, even though some of that network, it may not be a formal network, but there are people in this person's lives. And so what we kind of want to do is to be able to make sense of the relationships in someone's lives, and to support connection in ways that are safe. And of course, sometimes the relationships that are supportive within someone's informal network may also be quite risky. And so we've kind of got to balance, how do we support, helpful relationships in this person's life without increasing risk. If we're saying, well, you need to stay connected to family, but actually there's some problems in those relationships, and we've got to work out how to balance that. But really, what the kind of focus is on not only my helping relationship with you right now, but if there's something helpful about this relationship, how can we make sure that you've got another relationship that's a bit helpful like that for when I'm not around? And a kind of example of this that I just wanted to share, and you could sort of Google and find out a bit more about, is what Camden have been doing in their kind of early help community. So Camden have their Resilient Families program, which combines Camden specific kind of innovation and expertise and local expertise with elements of AMBIT and elements of the family partnership model. They've created a kind of a shared training program across the whole early help community. So really including all of the kind of community organisations and relationships that might be involved in a family's life. And really their focus is on not just sort of having specialist services who swoop in and try and help in sort of temporary ways, but how do you strengthen relationships between people and those community organisations, but also between those community organisations and local authority organisations. So part of the idea of that shared training programme is to have some common language and some common approach, so that it doesn't feel massively different to talk to one service over another, but also to support the relationships between the workers across those, so it feels more like a sort of a team where there's some trust and some help seeking between people. Okay, I'm going to move on to thinking about how we apply mentalizing to working in the network. So the sort of the problem, I guess, within networks is often when people have, and of course it's not uncommon for people to have multiple needs, and we often view these needs as quite separate. Here I've sort of got an example of a young person who's feeling low, they're at risk of school exclusion, perhaps they've experienced abuse at home, that there's not enough money in the family. It's evidence kind of shows that problems occurring together is not the exception at all. But of course they interact in multiple directions that it's very often kind of hard to get a formulation. What often happens, and in a way it's the strength of our system, we have workers for each of these different problems, possibly all from different services, and it's both brilliant that we have that, but can get really complicated for us and for the people that we're trying to help. And of course, each of us, however much we try to kind of avoid it, we've got our particular language, our jargon, our acronyms that we use. We've got different rules about boundaries. You can text one worker, but you definitely shouldn't text another worker. That would be inappropriate. So kind of at best, it's confusing. At worst, particularly for people who struggle to make any trusting relationships, if they're now asked to make 6 different relationships, each asking them to talk about really difficult, painful aspects of their lives, we can inadvertently provide a kind of a system of help that feels at best confusing and baffling, but at worst actually a negative experience, particularly when, if as services we just start to disagree with each other a little bit and pull in different directions. I think, you know, if we think of mentalizing and the fact that under stress we struggle to mentalize, if you then think about the fact that each of these workers in this rather complex, confusing situation, they're likely to be a bit stressed and struggling to mentalize. They might be putting a bit more effort into trying to mentalize this young person in the middle. Often it's then hard to have space to try and mentalize one another. And so we can get quite cross. I can feel like other workers don't get it, or they're not respecting me, or that they're kind of they've got completely the wrong end of the stick about something. So the focus, I guess, is on trying to create whole systems that can just maintain a bit more mentalizing, to recognize that kind of disintegration where we pull in different directions is normal. It's kind of not a criticism. It's bound to happen when you've got different people with different training, different service priorities, different funding sources, and so on. There's going to be times when we pull in different directions. So what I've got to kind of try to do is to hold a mentalizing stance towards those other people in the network. And importantly, if I'm getting a bit cross with other people in the network, there's a pretty good chance they're probably getting cross with me as well and struggling to mentalize where I'm coming from. So I want to make some explicit efforts to make myself understandable to other people in the network. And then how do we help, in this example here, our young person to be able to make sense of these different workers and what they're about and why they're there and why they've got slightly different views about something. So that what we're trying to do is I'm sort of recognizing that this young person has got multiple needs. I'm seeing it as part of my job, whoever I am in the system, to think about that whole system of care, because if I don't, then we may create a negative experience, but it's also quite unlikely that what I'm offering will be helpful if I haven't thought about how it fits with everything else. So we've got a few tools, some sort of mapping tools to make sense of networks with a client, to work out where is their trust already, what sense are you making of these different people and what their role is, and do these two talk together enough, or do we need to kind of get everyone in the room and work this out a bit? So that's a kind of this one here is a kind of a tool for really trying to make sense of the relationships from the person's perspective. And then we've got another tool, we call it the disintegration grid, that's kind of more for professionals to just really try and spend some time making sense of the perspectives of the different workers and trying to understand, because it can be quite easy to get into, particularly when there's high risk and emotions are up here, we can get into sort of a bit of blaming or getting quite certain about the intentions of other workers, often in rather inaccurate ways. So AMBIT, if you're interested, has got some tools for thinking about that. I wanted to just give another kind of practice example. So in Lancashire and South Cumbria, they've kind of created a whole system training program, and this is particularly geared towards working with young people where there's high risk and probably the need for the involvement of multiple agencies. So they've kind of done a train the trainer in AMBIT. So they've trained up people as AMBIT trainers from health, social care, education, and the voluntary organisations to kind of go out there and disseminate the model across those areas. So it's not necessarily that you've got, you know, any one team that's kind of completely using AMBIT wholesale, kind of off the peg, but there's some shared understanding, some shared thinking, and some shared kind of language around how we function as networks around the needs of particular clients. That's kind of across the whole system. And finally, the last sort of thing that I just wanted to say on networks was one idea about how you kind of balance the need for integration with the need to respond to all of a person or family's needs. So of course, the most integrated possible situation you could have is to have a single worker who just does everything. But that might be just a bit too integrated because no one person can possibly meet all of somebody's needs. At the other end, where you have loads of people so that you've got all the expertise, but you've kind of got no integration whatsoever. So we're always sort of trying to find that balance between meeting the multiple needs in the most effective sort of evidence-based way, but creating something that feels tolerable and integrated. So one example is that, you know, that traditional team around the family idea of the family in the middle with kind of all of the different professionals. We're definitely not saying that there's anything wrong with that. And for people who are able to make relationships and make sense of relationships with different workers, they get the best of everything that's on offer, and that's absolutely appropriate. But where that trust in help is a lot harder for the person to get to at the moment, or it's just overwhelming but because of the amount of appointments and things, we kind of have some ideas around a shift to a bit more of a team around the worker model, so that we might try and work out where is there a relationship where there's trust already? How can other people involved make sure that they really sort of respect that relationship and support it? Because sometimes inadvertently, by us joining a helping system, we can slightly complicate and mess up bits that were working well already. So how do we make sure that we work out, what does that worker need, that one who does have the relationship? How might we be able to help them? So it's not sort of necessarily, you know, I'm never going to see the client myself and I'm just going to, you know, leave everything to one worker, but much more, how can I make sure that they feel supported, and that some of my expertise that at the moment I'm not being able to use because the person doesn't want to see me, how can I sort of share some of that expertise through a relationship of trust that already exists? And of course the risk there particularly is if you're that key worker, that you feel an awful lot of pressure and that you're holding a lot of risk. And so the idea of the team around the worker is that's not the case. We're privileging maybe one or a small number of trusting relationships, but it's a team approach, it's a network approach. All of these people are involved and are holding accountability too. So an example of that is in Cambridgeshire, the Cambridgeshire Child and Adolescent Substance Use Service. And they kind of have a consultation approach based on the team around the worker idea. So what they were finding was often they were getting referrals for young people for whom their cannabis or alcohol use was one sort of symptom, one part of a more complicated picture, and perhaps the substance use was, in the young person's mind, their solution to some of the other things. And in cases like that, where there were multiple other workers involved, and they sort of felt like, you know, us just getting involved and offering some intervention that's just completely disconnected from all of the other good work that's going on could do more harm than good. What they do is see, is there an existing relationship of trust, whether it's with a teacher or a social worker or a youth worker or a CAMS worker, whoever it might be, where instead of seeing the young person directly, that they might support that worker to provide kind of basic substance use interventions, some information giving around harm, some tips about how to cut down, whatever it is, that's going to be much more effective coming from, yes, someone who's not a substance use specialist, but they're going to be more effective than a substance use specialist who hasn't got any relationship with the client, if they have got a relationship with the young person. So that's just one example of this kind of using this team around the worker approach. And then finally, then we'll pause for questions. I just want to say a bit about the sort of the bottom quadrant of the AMBIT wheel, which is about learning at work. And it's kind of relevant that the rest of the wheel sits upon this. So the kind of dilemma is, how do we, when we're often constantly responding to need, often there are crises, staff sickness, things that we have to deal with, how do we find space or protect space within that to keep learning, both from the evolving sort of evidence out there, but also from our own experience? How do we capture and keep that learning as we go along so that we don't lose it? And often what we hear is, well, of course, it's pretty obvious everyone would want to do that, but there's just no time. That's the sort of thing that always gets cut out of the calendar when we're really busy. And I guess we all do feel that. We offer a slight challenge, which is that actually if we don't do that, then we might keep doing things that aren't as helpful as they could be. And so in a sense, there's a kind of a moral imperative to protect time for learning so we can get better at what we do. We can keep getting better. It's a kind of a continual improvement idea. Otherwise, we might just keep doing what we've always done and miss out on an opportunity to do something much more effective and efficient. What I haven't said very much about is these bits on the outside of the wheel. Each quadrant of the wheel has got them, and they're sort of the AMBIT stance. They're things that are, often pretty common sense, good areas of practice, but that pull you in opposite directions and that you kind of want to find a balance between. So in learning at work, I just wanted to talk about that, because the balance that we're trying to find is between respect for evidence, so kind of external research-based evidence. Of course, if there's evidence out there that one thing is more effective than another, then we should apply it. But, very often for people who've got multiple needs, there isn't a great deal of evidence about what works. Research often tends to focus on one particular need. There's, of course, always limited generalizability from one particular place where the research took place and your particular context, the particular area, geographic area that you work in, what the other services are around you. There's so many different variables that you kind of got to balance that with your own local expertise that you're developing over time about the particular needs of the people that you serve, where you fit within the rest of the network. So you don't want to kind of go too far one way or another and stick too doggedly to the evidence and you're not adapting it appropriately. If we only ever think about our own local expertise, then we might be missing out on lots of evidence-based ways of working. So we're trying to find that balance, but to create a kind of a whole team or whole system culture of learning and continual improvement. And the relationship to mentalizing is, very, very similar. That under stress, it's hard to do the reflection and the thinking. If we can create space by having some team culture and some team routines to be able to zoom out and get perspective on the work and what's working. So we're sort of trying to find this balance between research evidence, our own kind of experience, practice-based evidence, and then what clients, what children, young people and families are telling us about what's helpful. We've got to explicitly find ways to look at all three and kind of work out where's the spot in the middle that's the perfect balance of those. And so part of the AMBIT approach is that we hold on to that learning, and we do that learning by writing about it as a kind of a group task. So teams that use AMBIT, they have an online AMBIT manual, and it contains about 1,000 pages on the AMBIT approach that AMBIT teams capture as they learn things, as learning kind of events come up. They capture their model so that you're kind of combining AMBIT with your own expertise about how it works in practice for you. So that's all I'm going to say about that. We will share some slides. So Julia, have we got some questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you to start off with, Liz. Obviously, having a relational approach is a fundamental part of setting up a family hub model, and there are lots being used across the country. I was just wondering if you have any reflections from your experience about what facilitates successful implementation and sustaining an approach being used in practice like this.
That's a good question. Obviously, one of the things that we do is provide training, but the evidence that training alone creates change that's implementable and sustainable is not great. So I think one of the key things is kind of involving all stakeholders in whether a particular approach that you're choosing is going to be helpful before kind of training, getting people together, working out what are the things that are working really well that we wouldn't want some new model to come in and kind of get in the way of. And very often, different services will be using different models. So doing some of the thinking about, okay, if we're using family partnership model, if we're using signs of safety as well, how do we make sure that they kind of fit together? And doing that kind of thinking first and involving all of the key stakeholders in that then means that when you come to try and implement something, it can sort of sit better. But I think also, implementation science suggests that explicitly giving people specific roles in the implementation rather than just kind of hoping for the best, which I think is what we often do, but having a sort of a core group of people whose responsibility it is to keep kind of driving forward implementation is key.
And one of the other things, a couple of years ago, the Early Intervention Foundation, who are our evidence partner here in the National Centre, did a piece of research with a number of areas across the country looking at their family hubs approaches and where children's centres had got to. And one of the things that came through quite strongly there in terms of how to facilitate integration across agencies was this training together, and that in fact practitioners felt that it was even more important than being co-located perhaps. And I just wondered whether you had any reflections about the learning and the relationship building that takes place within the training.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, that, doesn't it, that just being located in the same place, if that doesn't facilitate more kind of conversations and relationship building and conversations about the right stuff, it doesn't necessarily on its own lead to better integration or relationships. But you can sort of imagine that a training event that's getting people thinking and talking about the work together, and getting to be able to see what's in one another's minds. I guess that would be the sort of the mentalizing way of looking at it, is that it's helping you to be able to mentalize others in the network. So yeah, I think shared training spaces, often on AMBIT trainings, there's probably more learning going on just by bringing people together in the same room and facilitating some conversations about this than anything fancy that we offer. It's often more about facilitating the building of those relationships.
We've got a question here in the Q&A, which is quite a long one, so I'll read it out to you. So this is coming from Rachel, and she says, as a researcher, myself and team found ourselves creating a mentalization-based toolkit for recruiting parents referred to us by social services. And what you said about the thought that someone might be struggling and therefore not ready to let them go has really struck a chord with her. She found it challenging to balance a parent telling us that they're struggling and cannot possibly join the study, but also really wanting them to benefit from the study. So listening to their problems and making them feel heard, establishing trust with us versus the need to be careful about perceived coercion to join the study. And she wonders whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, if I've understood, it's this sort of dilemma between thinking, we've got something that could be helpful, and if you could just engage, I'm I'm sure it would help. And so sometimes taking a much sort of less assertive, well, it's entirely up to you, doesn't feel like the moral thing to do in a sense. Sometimes I guess I guess it depends how that is experienced. If it's no, you've got to attend, or you're gonna lose this, you know, that's a kind of coercive, but trying to make sense of what the barriers might be. Because I guess sometimes for us as workers, we get a bit frustrated because we can't understand why the person won't just come along to the group or whatever the thing is, because you think self-evidently it's going to be helpful. But of course, people do respond to things in ways that make sense on the basis of what they're thinking and feeling. So yeah, I'm not really adding anything to what Rachel's already said there, but just trying to understand it and make sense of it.
Thank you so much. I can see we're coming up to 1 o'clock now, so just wanted to say thank you again so much for coming this afternoon, Liz, and thank you everyone for joining, and for our training team helping behind the scenes. As I said at the start, you're going to receive the slides. You'll also receive a follow-up survey in the email after the event, and we really welcome your feedback. This is like the first one of our bite-sized training sessions, so any feedback you have about what was useful and what we might do in the program going forward would be much appreciated. If you're interested in finding out more about AMBIT, please do head over to our website. We'll pop a link in the chat now. And just a reminder again that you can book onto our upcoming learning events on our website. So Integrated Care Systems on the 1st of June, Infant Mental Health, Trauma and Cultural Sensitivity on the 15th. And do sign up to our Family Hubs in Mind newsletter to receive details of future events and resources. Thank you very much, everyone. See you again soon.